Silver Ridge, Montana Territory. October 1886. When Caleb Merritt announced he was building his winter shelter inside Whitestone Cave, the town's master builder called it a death trap disguised as shelter. The mayor said it was an insult to proper pioneering. His own neighbors stopped speaking to him. What did this former railroad carpenter understand about heat retention that the territory's most experienced builders missed? Today, you're about to discover why the worst idea in Silver Ridge became the most copied survival technique in Montana. If you want to receive real frontier techniques that worked when life literally depended on it, hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because this story might save your life someday. Let's go back to the autumn when one man's madness became a town's salvation. Caleb Merritt wasn't a dreamer. He was a 34-year-old railroad carpenter who'd spent 7 winters in Montana, and he knew exactly what was coming. Every autumn, the same ritual: men hauling 8, 10, sometimes 12 cords of firewood to their cabins. Women stuffing every crack with moss and clay. Children sleeping 3 to a bed under buffalo hides. And still, by January, ice formed on the inside walls. The problem wasn't effort. It was physics. A standard log cabin in Silver Ridge had 4 exposed walls, a roof, and a floor suspended above frozen ground. Every surface bled heat into air that could drop to 40 below. The firebox had to fight 6 directions of heat loss simultaneously. Families burned through a winter's worth of wood by February, then started dismantling furniture, fence posts, anything combustible. Caleb had watched a family of 5 nearly freeze to death the previous winter when their wood supply ran out during a 3-week cold snap. The father had 3rd-degree frostbite. 2 children developed pneumonia. That's when Caleb started thinking differently. Whitestone Cave, set a quarter-mile east of town, a limestone hollow carved by an ancient underground river. The entrance faced south, protected from prevailing northwest winds. The cave ran back 30 feet into the hillside, with a ceiling height of 9 feet and a width of roughly 14. Local hunters used it to dress game. Kids dared each other to explore the dark interior. Nobody considered it shelter. Caleb saw something else, a structure that nature had already insulated. 3 sides and a roof of solid limestone, buffered by tons of earth that held stable temperatures year-round. Only one wall to build. One surface to lose heat through. He'd watched crews dig railroad tunnels through winter, and he remembered how warm it stayed underground, even when surface temperatures plunged. In late September, he started hauling lumber to the cave. By mid-October, word had spread through Silver Ridge. Caleb Merritt was building his winter home inside a hole in the ground. What Caleb built defied every principle of proper frontier construction, and that's exactly why it worked. First, he sealed the cave entrance with a double-walled structure. The outer wall, vertical logs chinked with clay and moss, standard construction. But 18 inches behind it, he built a second wall of split pine planks. Between them, he packed dry prairie grass and wood shavings, creating an insulated airspace that trapped heat like a wool blanket traps body warmth. The entrance itself was offset. Instead of a door facing directly outside, Caleb built a small vestibule, an enclosed porch that created an additional buffer zone. Cold air had to pass through 2 doorways and turn 90 degrees before reaching the living space. Wind couldn't blast straight in. Inside, he positioned his firebox against the limestone back wall, which would become a massive heat battery. Limestone has high thermal mass, meaning it absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. A cast-iron stove pressed against tons of limestone would turn the entire back wall into a radiator that stayed warm hours after the fire died. He dug a shallow trench along the cave floor perimeter and filled it with river stones, then covered them with flat limestone slabs to create a raised floor. This kept his living space above the coldest air, which would sink into the trench, and gave him a secondary thermal mass that would absorb radiant heat from the stove. For ventilation, he drilled a 4-inch hole through the cave ceiling, 15 feet back from the entrance, and fitted it with a stovepipe that extended 6 feet above the hillside. The natural draft from the underground space would pull fresh air through the vestibule and exhaust smoke efficiently without the backdraft problems that plague conventional chimneys in high winds. The entire design worked with natural forces instead of fighting them. The Earth's stable temperature, thermal mass storage, convection currents, insulated barriers, controlled airflow. It looked strange. It looked primitive. It looked like something a desperate man would build when he'd given up on real shelter. The town thought he'd lost his mind. Harold Sutherland had built 43 structures in Montana Territory. Homes, barns, a church, the Territorial Land Office. When men needed construction advice, they asked Harold. When disputes arose about building methods, Harold settled them. He was Silver Ridge's authority on what worked and what didn't. And Harold Sutherland hated Caleb's cave cabin. "That limestone will weep moisture all winter," he announced at Jensen's general store, loud enough for the dozen men present to hear. "Your firewood will rot. Your bedding will mold. You'll wake up breathing fungus. And when spring runoff comes, that cave will flood and trap you inside like a rat in a barrel." He turned to face Caleb directly. "I've been building in this territory for 19 years. What you're doing isn't pioneering. It's suicide with extra steps. That cave will become your tomb, and I won't be the one who helps dig you out." The words carried weight because Harold had earned his credibility through 2 decades of structures that stood while others failed. When Harold said something wouldn't work, people listened. Others piled on. Frank Morrison, who operated the lumber mill. "You spent good money on materials to build a burrow. That's not a home, Merritt. That's admitting defeat before winter even starts." Pastor Henricks. Man was given dominion over the earth, not instructed to crawl into it like a beast. There's something unnatural about living underground. Even the women whispered their judgment. Sarah Cutler told her husband within Caleb's earshot, "A real man builds a proper home. What kind of wife would want to live in a cave? He'll die alone in that hole, and good riddance." The criticism wasn't just about construction methods. It was about identity. Pioneers conquered the frontier. They built upward, visible, defiant against the elements. Caleb's cave cabin represented retreat, hiding, fear. It violated an unspoken code about how a man should face winter. By late November, Caleb ate his meals at home instead of the boarding house. He bought supplies during off hours to avoid crowds. Children pointed and laughed when he walked past. Silver Ridge had decided. Caleb Merritt's cave wasn't just a bad idea. It was an embarrassment to the entire settlement. Nobody visited his shelter. Nobody asked questions about his methods. When snow started falling in early December, people made bets about how long he'd last before crawling back to town, begging for a corner in someone's cabin. They'd find out soon enough. The mountains had something coming that would test every structure in Montana Territory. The blizzard arrived on January 19th, 1887, and it didn't leave for 9 days. It started as a normal winter storm. Heavy snow, dropping temperatures, wind out of the northwest. Silver Ridge had seen worse. Men stoked their fires, women checked their food stores, children played in the first deep snow of the season. By evening, 18 inches had fallen, and the temperature had dropped to 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Then it got serious. January 20th, another 2 feet of snow. Temperature at 6 above zero. Wind gusting to 40 miles per hour, creating drifts that buried ground floor windows. Men had to shovel paths to their woodsheds every 3 hours or lose access completely. January 21st. The temperature hit 8 below. The wind didn't stop. It screamed across the valley like something alive and hungry, finding every gap in every wall, turning homes into wind tunnels. Families burned through wood at twice the normal rate just to keep interior temperatures above freezing. By January 23rd, Silver Ridge was in genuine trouble. Temperatures had bottomed at 27 below zero. The snow had stopped falling, but wind-driven ground blizzards reduced visibility to zero. Drifts reached the eaves of cabins. Several families had exhausted their firewood supplies and were burning furniture, floorboards, anything combustible. The real crisis was the cold penetrating the structures themselves. In Harold Sutherland's well-built cabin, ice formed a 1/4 inch thick on the inside of the north wall, despite a roaring fire. The Hendricks family abandoned their home on the fourth day when frost began growing on their sleeping children's faces. 8 families crowded into the town hall, which had a large central fireplace but still struggled to maintain 40 degrees inside. Conventional log cabins, even well-constructed ones, were losing the thermal battle. The exposed wood walls, suspended floors, and ventilated attics that worked fine in moderate cold became catastrophic liabilities at sustained extreme temperatures. Heat poured out in every direction. The fireboxes couldn't keep up. Families huddled within 3 feet of their stoves, leaving the rest of their homes to ice. On January 25th, the 6th day, Mayor Wickham organized a supply check. 13 households had less than 3 days of firewood remaining. 5 families had children showing early symptoms of hypothermia despite being indoors. 2 elderly residents had developed severe frostbite on their extremities without ever stepping outside. The situation had become a survival crisis, and nobody had seen Kayla Merritt in town since the storm began. Harold Sutherland assumed the worst. He's probably dead in that cave, frozen or suffocated. We'll dig him out in spring. But something stopped him from checking. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was the quiet certainty that he'd been right, and confirming Caleb's death would feel less like vindication and more like failure. The blizzard finally broke on January 27th. The wind died. The sun emerged. The temperature climbed to a merciful 6 below zero. Silver Ridge began digging out, counting losses, checking on neighbors. That's when Deputy Marshal Graves went to Whitestone Cave to look for Caleb Merritt's body. What he found instead would change everything Harold Sutherland thought he knew about frontier construction. Deputy Marshal Richard Graves wasn't expecting to find Caleb Merritt alive. Nobody was. He'd volunteered to check the cave because he'd served with Caleb on a railroad crew 6 years earlier, and he owed the man at least the dignity of a proper recovery. He trudged through waist-deep drifts on the morning of January 28th, the day after the blizzard broke, carrying a wool blanket to wrap whatever he found. The hillside around Whitestone Cave was buried under snow, sculpted into massive drifts by 9 days of relentless wind. The cave entrance was nearly invisible, just a dark shadow behind a wall of white. Graves had to dig for 20 minutes to reach the outer door of Caleb's vestibule. He knocked. No answer. He knocked harder, calling out. Still nothing. His stomach tightened. He forced the door open against packed snow and stepped into the vestibule. The space was cold, but not brutally so, maybe 20 degrees. He could see his breath, but the wind was completely blocked. The inner door was latched from inside. Graves pounded on it. "Caleb, it's Richard Graves. Can you hear me?" A scraping sound. The latch lifted. The door opened, and Caleb Merritt stood there in his shirt sleeves, no coat, holding a tin cup of coffee. Behind him, Graves could see the glow of a small fire in the stove. The air that rolled out of the cave interior felt warm against his frozen face. "Morning, Richard," Caleb said calmly. "Wasn't expecting company. Storm finally break?" Graves just stared. "Yeah, you're fine. Little bored, honestly. Been 9 days since I've talked to another human. Come in. Let me shut this door before we lose the heat." What Graves saw inside that cave would become the most discussed topic in Silver Ridge for the next decade. The interior temperature was warm enough that Graves immediately started sweating in his heavy coat. Caleb's thermometer, hanging on a limestone wall, read 52 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it was 6 below zero, a 58-degree difference. The cast-iron stove held a modest fire, not the roaring inferno Graves had expected. Caleb explained he'd been feeding it 3 small logs every 4 to 5 hours, sometimes stretching to 6 hours overnight. His woodpile, stacked neatly along one wall, looked barely touched. Graves did rough math in his head. Caleb had probably burned through a third of a cord in 9 days. Graves' own household had burned nearly 3 full cords in the same period. The limestone back wall behind the stove radiated heat like a massive brick oven. Graves held his hand 6 inches from the rock and felt steady warmth. "That wall stays warm for hours after the fire dies down," Caleb explained. "Limestone holds heat like nothing else. It's basically a 4,000-pound radiator that never turns off. There was no moisture problem, no mold, No condensation. The cave walls were dry to the touch. Caleb's bedding was completely dry. His food stores, his clothing, his firewood, all dry and well-preserved. The ventilation system worked flawlessly. Fresh air came in through the vestibule. Warm, stale air went out through the ceiling pipe, and the stove draft was so consistent Caleb said he'd never had smoke backdraft once. But the most striking thing was the comfort. The space felt livable in a way that transcended mere survival. Caleb had read 4 books during the blizzard. He'd cooked hot meals twice a day. He'd slept soundly under a single blanket instead of piled under furs while shivering. He'd spent 9 days in relative comfort while the rest of Silver Ridge fought for survival against the cold. "I knew it would work," Caleb said quietly, "but I didn't think it would work this well. When the storm hit and I felt how stable the temperature stayed, how little what I needed, I realized this isn't just good shelter. It's better than anything else in the territory." Graves needed to tell someone. He needed to tell everyone. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button right now, because you're about to see the numbers that made the most respected builder in Montana Territory eat his words. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what's the coldest winter you've ever experienced. Stay with me, because what happened next humiliated the correct method and changed frontier construction forever. Word spread through Silver Ridge faster than the blizzard had come. By noon on January 28th, a dozen men stood outside Whitestone Cave, waiting their turn to step inside and feel the impossible warmth. By evening, 40 people had made the trek through the snow drifts. By the next day, nearly the entire town had witnessed it. Harold Sutherland arrived on January 29th with a thermometer of his own, certain that Caleb's instrument was faulty or deliberately misread. He checked it against his own. Both read 51 degrees Fahrenheit inside the cave. Outside temperature, 4 below zero, a 55-degree difference. He checked Caleb's wood pile and estimated consumption. His professional assessment, delivered with visible reluctance, 1/5 the wood we burned. Maybe less. The numbers were undeniable, and people started doing calculations. During the 9-day blizzard, Caleb's cave cabin maintained an interior temperature between 48 and 56 degrees Fahrenheit with minimal fire management. Standard log cabins in town struggled to maintain 35 to 45 degrees with constant fire tending, and many dipped into the 20s during the coldest nights. Caleb burned approximately 0.4 cords of wood over 9 days. The average household in Silver Ridge burned 2.8 to 3.5 cords during the same period. That's a fuel efficiency difference of roughly 700 to 800%. After the fire died completely, Caleb's cave maintained livable temperatures above 45 degrees for 14 to 16 hours. Standard cabins dropped below freezing within 90 minutes to 2 hours after fire extinction. The limestone back wall, serving as thermal mass, held and radiated heat with measured efficiency. Harold calculated the wall's mass at approximately 4,200 pounds of limestone in direct contact with a firebox. At limestone's specific heat capacity, that represented a thermal battery capable of storing and slowly releasing roughly 180,000 BTUs of heat energy. It was a radiator that never needed fuel, just time and physics. The double-wall entrance system with vestibule eliminated wind infiltration entirely. Conventional cabins lost an estimated 30 to 40% of their heat to air exchange and drafts. Caleb's system had virtually zero convective heat loss through the entrance. The earth-insulated structure reduced conductive heat loss through walls, ceiling, and floor by an estimated 70 to 80% compared to exposed log construction. 3 sides and a roof of limestone backed by tons of earth created an insulation system no amount of mud chinking could match. But the most important number was the one that couldn't be measured in degrees or cords. 0. 0 cases of frostbite. 0 cold-related injuries. 0 hours spent in fear that the wood would run out. 0 children sleeping with frost on their faces. 0 nights wondering if the family would survive until morning. Mayor Wickham called an informal town meeting at the boarding house on February 1st. The topic wasn't listed, but everyone knew what it was about. Harold Sutherland stood before the assembled townspeople and said something nobody expected to hear. I was wrong about Caleb Merritt's construction. I was wrong about cave shelters. I was wrong about what makes good frontier housing. What he built isn't cowardice or retreat. It's engineering that works with nature instead of fighting it. And if I'd swallowed my pride and actually looked at his methods before winter, maybe some of us would have suffered less during that blizzard. It wasn't quite an apology, but from Harold Sutherland, it was close enough. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then Frank Morrison, the lumber mill operator, spoke up. There are 3 more caves within 5 miles of town. 2 face south, 1 faces east. I'm converting the east-facing one before next winter. That opened the floodgates. Questions poured out. How did Caleb build the double wall? What type of stones worked best for the floor? Could you modify an existing cabin with earth berming? What about ventilation in a smaller space? Caleb spent 2 hours answering questions, sketching designs on slate, explaining thermal mass and insulation principles in language that practical men could understand and apply. The transformation of Caleb's social status happened almost overnight. The man who'd eaten alone for 2 months found himself invited to dinner at 3 different homes in 1 week. The builder nobody would hire receive requests to consult on cave modifications, earth-sheltered additions, and thermal mass improvements. The fool who'd built a burrow became the expert everyone wanted to learn from. By the winter of 1888, 11 families within 30 miles of Silver Ridge had either converted natural caves into winter homes or dug earth-sheltered structures that incorporated Caleb's principles. Some were crude first attempts. Others showed remarkable sophistication, adding refinements like external greenhouses for additional insulation and fresh vegetables, or dual wall systems that could be ventilated in summer to prevent excess heat. The technique spread through word of mouth and practical demonstration. A prospector near Helena built a cave cabin that survived the winter of 1889 with similar results. A homesteading family near Bozeman dug their home 3 feet into a hillside and earth-bermed the walls, reducing their wood consumption by 60%. The methods evolved and adapted to different locations, different materials, different needs, but the core principle remained. Work with the earth, not against it. Caleb Merritt never built another structure for profit. He didn't need to. He'd proven something more valuable than any single building. That the wisdom wasn't always in following established methods. Sometimes it was in looking at the problem differently, understanding the physics, and having the courage to build something people would mock until the moment it saved their lives. The frontier wasn't conquered by brute force alone. It was survived by people who understood that nature wasn't an enemy to defeat. It was a system to study, respect, and use intelligently. Caleb's cave cabin stood for 43 years before being abandoned, not because it failed, but because Silver Ridge grew into a town with frame houses and coal heating. But the lesson it taught survived much longer. In Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and the Dakotas, you can still find old earth-sheltered homes and cave conversions that trace their lineage back to a man who refused to build the right way and instead built the smart way. The cold doesn't care about your pride. It doesn't respect tradition. It only responds to physics. Caleb understood that. The rest of Silver Ridge learned it the hard way. Sometimes the best shelter isn't the one that looks most impressive from the outside. It's the one that keeps you alive on the inside when everything else fails. Which part of Caleb's solution would you apply to your home today? Drop your answer in the comments below and tell us where you're watching from. And if you want more real frontier techniques that worked when life depended on it, make sure you're subscribed because we've got stories that will change how you think about survival, shelter, and the wisdom of people who built with nothing but necessity and intelligence. Thanks for watching. Stay warm out there. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.